Welcome to Detoxicity. This is a podcast in which I try to change the narrative around masculinity a little bit and allow some progressive voices and some interesting voices, diverse voices to come into the picture. My name is Mike Joseph. I host and produce this show, and I thank you very, very much for listening and for supporting from the bottom of my heart. It means a lot. Now, if you enjoy this podcast, I hope that you are subscribing to it. If you aren't, please press the subscribe button on wherever it is you're listening to it, and that way you'll get episodes on demand when they come, which is usually on Wednesday mornings. I also certainly ask that you spread the word. Please rate the podcast on whatever platform you're using to listen. Make sure you leave a comment if you have something nice to say, or if you have something constructive to say. It doesn't all have to be nice. And by all means, tell your friends, tell anyone who you think might get some creative juice or inspirational juice, or just would you'd like to listen to this. Please spread the word however you can. I am on social media. If you would like to follow me, I am on Instagram at DetoxPod Guy. My Twitter is on hiatus for a little bit. It will come back, but it is Tis Mike Joseph. Feel free to follow me on either of those platforms. There is also facebook.com/detoxicity. And if you have a comment, you can email me, detoxpod@gmail.com. I am always on the lookout for new guests. So if you know somebody who you think has an interesting story to tell or something to add to the overall conversation around detoxifying masculinity, please reach out to me via any of those platforms. And certainly if you yourself would like to be a part of this podcast, please reach out. Let me know. Once again, I thank you for listening. In this episode of Detoxicity, I had the pleasure of sitting down with Glen Phillips. Glen has been touring and releasing records for over 3 decades as a solo artist and as the frontman and principal songwriter for the band Toad the Wet Sprocket. During our conversation, Glen discusses how he felt as an incredibly sensitive young man. He extols the virtues of community-based singing and talks about making more of an effort to reach across the table, as it were, and find ways to relate to folks who may exist on different sides of the political spectrum from him. Glen also reels off the names of several books that have helped him along his journey. You might want to keep a list. This is a book club in the making. Anyway, check out our conversation.
I'm Glen Phillips, singer-songwriter for Toad the Wet Sprocket. I also do a lot of touring solo and do community choir leading, and waiting for the time when that is, once again, not a super spreader event.
Sure.
I don't know if that's the best intro, but that's what I got.
I can go forward from there. So I'm going to fanboy out a little bit, and hopefully this doesn't make you uncomfortable.
Okay.
I discovered you when I was in high school.
Mm-hmm.
So early 90s, I was watching Friday night videos or Saturday morning videos, and one of those things, and the video for All I Want came on, and I immediately felt in identification, in attraction. I don't know what it was, but there was something that was like, I want to listen to these guys more and find out what they're about. And that was a long, long time ago. But here we are, almost 30 years later, having this conversation. And I'm wondering, the thing that I identified with was a sensitivity that I don't think I would have been able to articulate back then, coming from where I come from culturally, and even from a musical perspective, which was at the time hip hop and more sort of macho / aggressive music.
Mm-hmm.
Your lyrics and your presentation just came from a different place than what I was used to. And I'm curious if that was cultivated or if that was just who you were. You didn't really seem to have any artifice, and you didn't seem to have any extra machismo. You weren't being hard. You were being very sensitive and intentional and open in a way that I think was uncommon, and I think still is to a certain extent.
Thank you. I don't know if anything was intentional other than we were trying to write songs that meant something to us and not trying to fit in too hard. I think we did one album. I think the Dulcinea album, we were definitely trying. We wanted things more muscular and sounding like we sounded live. But still, as far as content goes, I've always been more of a hippie And so we were writing from a perspective that was more gentle and more vulnerable than a lot of what was going on back in the day, and probably still now, but in a more conscious fashion. I think early on there was a lot of lyric writing that was, I don't know, maybe getting away with things a little more. Just as long as it rhymed and sounded like I might know what it was about, I could get away with it. But yeah, I mean, my upbringing was even, my parents were both scientists. I had this kind of ethical Judaism as a background, but then for the that was the ethical side of things, but for spirituality early on, my dad was taking me to those Zen Priory for meditation classes and was giving me books by Idris Shah. And so I had a little bit of a background in that from early on. And we weren't a sportsy family. I was talking with my brother today, and we were reading lots of sci-fi as a family, reading Dune and the Foundation trilogy and Stranger in a Strange Land. And our dinner conversation was always politics and religion. So I think more than anything, I always felt outside of the aggression that a lot of my other male friends had growing up. I found it easier to make friends with girls when I was a boy, just because they were a little more gentle. I didn't get the guy things as much.
Did that gentleness or that upbringing, which I think is a little unusual, and I don't know. Look, I don't know how everybody lives in the world, so I don't know how unusual that is in the grand scheme of things. But did that cause any conflict growing up, whether internally or with people your age?
No, I mean, I felt like an outsider a lot. I got beat up a few times, who didn't? But I also just remember as like a little kid thinking that if everybody was feeling as much as I was feeling, I didn't understand how people functioned, if that makes sense. And I think every kid maybe goes through a little of that. I felt like my feelings were so intense that I was like almost always having to get in front of them or on top of them. I remember reading this book by Amy Koppelman called A Mouthful of Air. I think she's just made a film of it. It was the first description of depression and anxiety that I'd ever read that I felt explained how I felt inside for a lot of my childhood and even a lot of my adulthood. Where, I mean, in the same way, if you have real stomach pain, but you're talking to somebody you respect and care about, you're not going to let on, right? The conversation is more important than you expressing in any way that you're uncomfortable. And so you just kind of deal with and sublimate it. And I always, as a kid especially, felt emotionally like everything was so intense for me that I was usually trying not to cry or trying not to kind of lose it or be just overly emotional publicly. And so that's an isolating experience. And I think there's a degree to which a lot of people feel that, at least from time to time. There's a universality to that feeling like nobody knows what's happening inside me. It's mine
Right.
alone. And everybody's carrying that same feeling. But I don't think there was a lot of good emotional caretaking, especially for boys. In an intellectual family, if I would be crying, I remember being told, go to your room until you can act like a human being. And this feeling like, I think I'm acting like a human being.
Was that in
But,
response specifically to crying, or was that in response to something else?
yeah, or just being emotional, being in anything that was impassioned, right? And often for me, yeah, sadness or feeling of if things felt unjust, or if I remember a lot of crying alone in my room as a kid. And there's negative bias. Those are the things we remember. And I had a loving, good family. I mean, there wasn't anything abusive. I just had a whole lot of feeling all the time and didn't have skills. And it was kind of just the edge of a generation that became psychologically oriented and became oriented towards talking about vulnerability or talking about emotional intelligence and the idea that especially if you live in a kind of insane society, seeing a professional about your mental health in the same way you should see your doctor before you have cancer. You check in, you do these things, you take care of yourself, and you get tips on how to take care of yourself. And I feel like therapy in a culture as out of whack as ours is, like, you get help before it's
Mm-hmm.
dire, before the slitty wristies.
Oh,
Like,
yes.
it's and as a young man around the age of 16, 17, I met this guy, Robinson Eikenberry, who really changed my life, where he was reading Robert Bly books and have had this psychological vocabulary and this kind of philosophical vocabulary that really informed me and changed my life and changed my path to these things that felt like home when I walked into them, but I hadn't known of their existence before, and or that it was okay to be that way, you know? So yeah, once again, that was
Was this a peer, or was it someone older that kind of maybe had like a mentor type of, or
he was a year or two over. I mean, I've started using the word friendtor often.
I've never.
I would like more elders as teacher. And my dad passed away when I was 27. So I haven't had that experience of watching my father age and being able to share kind of what it's like to become an older man, right? And so a lot of my biggest teachers are closer in age, and increasingly more friends. I'm 50 now, more friends in their 60s. So they've gone through a little more than I have. But Robinson was just a couple years older. His father had taken his life when Robinson was maybe 16. So he'd been catapulted into needing to figure out what was inside his mind, what was inside his soul, what was really important. He was always a mystic, but depending on how you want to look at it, he either had some kind of a psychological break or had a third eye opening in his early 20s. He had a context to kind of contain the things that he was perceiving, that instead of being medicated and instead of being sent off to an institution, he actually was able to really develop a reckoning and a language around what he saw. And so he ended up being this weird kind of standalone sadhu of some kind. He produced music for people, and he did a few larger acts, but it was mostly local acts, and people would find him, like a woman who'd never written a song, and at 40 she all of a sudden had these songs in her and she wanted to get them out, and he would be this creative midwife for
Wow.
people and would meet people as long as they wanted to express themselves. He was there for them. Didn't matter good or bad. He would help them make the best album they could and invite their soul to unfold. And one of the things he would do to like amuse himself would be to go to a restaurant and look around and see a couple that he thought was interesting and anonymously pay for their meal and ask the wait person to suggest that they pay it forward to somebody else that they were drawn to anonymously. And sometimes he would check in with the people at the restaurants because they knew him, and they'd go like, yeah, it went 5 deep last night, man.
Wow.
You know, he just had this delight in life and in people and this openness. And he also saw ghosts and angels. But when he first started seeing these things, he had the need to convince people that what he was seeing was true. And eventually he just kind of, it was in the background of how he saw the world, but he was just this incredibly loving, open person. And so I got to see this, my dearest friend, who was in this state of spiritual ecstasy most of the time, and also spiritual agony some of the time. His imagination could run away with him. And once again, having a skeptic's mind, I never know if that is about certain synaptic connections or neurotransmitter overloads. Or, you know, it can
Right.
be those things, but for him to hold a framework to make it useful and to remain in service constantly to others was an incredibly inspiring thing. Most cultures hold people like that in a very, very
Mm-hmm.
high regard. And so he was really influential. I think I would have been a heavily medicated muggle if I had not met him.
Well, it's good to know that you're not a that's a tongue twister, heavily medicated. Do you find that because of the nature of the songs you write, that people come up to you almost as if you're a therapist, that you get a lot of people asking for advice, or people opening up to you in a way that that maybe seems a little bit, wow, why are you opening up to me this much?
Well, some, and I also have a habit of oversharing. I open up to other people as well. And so part of that's reciprocal. I think people feel safe around me to share. And it's strange when it's through music because I've learned to guard myself better against this, to never want to turn anybody away. But I'm not a mental health professional and I'm not a minister and I'm not trained in these things. And so I've become better at filtering out, like, you need to find a therapy, but also trying to frame things for people a little bit and help them to go on. But I also notice if you do a little bit of that, then the doors are open. And so trying to find whatever the compassionate middle ground is in not refusing help if it's asked for, but also kind of protecting my own privacy and the sanctity of my life. So yeah, that can come in sometimes. And what's interesting too is that the music, I think I write with a combination of specificity and ambiguity. I think emotional specificity, but situational ambiguity. So there are a lot of people who are shocked if they find out I'm not an evangelical Christian.
Heard
I've
to me.
also had people, yeah, well, I use a lot of
Sure.
Christian imagery because that's the mythology of our culture. And so Judeo-Christian imagery is everywhere. And so that comes out because that's our language. And at the same time, I've had somebody who was, I think it was the Dulcineum, that for them felt like it was entirely about coming out of the closet and being yourself. And so it makes me so happy that someone who's had that experience could assume that I've shared that experience, and a Christian could think I've shared that experience. Because I think I'm just trying to write about what it feels like to be a human being. And somebody told me the quote a while ago, the world is as we are, right? We see the world through our own
Right.
personal perspective. We like to think that people are kind of like us. And so if you're able to speak a little bit universally, but still hit people deeply, I mean, I appreciate that. And it's been interesting in recent years to try to be more specific, which maybe makes things less broad, but I feel like can be more powerful. In the last 8 years or so, I haven't had as much output, or at least as much public output, but I feel like I gained an appreciation beyond, how can I say this? I feel like I'd lost for a while what the soul of music was, or the soul of creation, what creating art was. And it became a job. And my job was getting smaller every year. And I was resenting it. And I would still make music I cared about, but I felt like I would just get, kicked in the balls every album I put out. And it was getting smaller and smaller and more difficult and more contentious in the band. And after my divorce, I found community singing and started doing that and leading that. I found my way into some plant medicine work and kind of really sacred music that was from an entirely different direction. And I think those things gave me back this sense of how healing and powerful music is and how utterly necessary it is. And so I started doing a lot more music that wasn't public at all. And I've been doing it 5 years or so now. And it's one of my favorite things in the universe. And I've never advertised it. And to do something that was not transactional at
Mm.
all and was about just a reciprocity of spirit And it was so good to get a basis in that. And it's helped me bring more meaning back into solo touring or band touring or these other things. But I had to do stuff that was really off the map in order to regain a trust into what the actual purpose of music was for me. And so it has not been a typical linear rock and roll kind of progression.
Which, as you were talking, that posed two questions in my head. One, which you kind of answered. At any point, have you ever been like, fuck this music shit, I'm going to go and brew coffee? Or, I don't know, landscape or work at the post office?
Yeah, it's a kind of a constant source of stress in my life is since I didn't buy a house back when it was feasible and with divorce, I haven't had a place. And so I'm living in Santa Barbara, which is just a bit of a treadmill financially. You know, you're paying. I can be at the beach. It's sunny today and I'm 5 minutes from the
I'm
beach.
twice as jealous.
And I can go for a run on the beach, and it's only 15 minutes to a trailhead to take me up the Front Range. And the beauty and the power and the accessibility of nature here is pretty unmatched. But you pay for that. And it's a bubble culturally. It's a very rich, safe, white environment. And, you know, and here, you know, white and Hispanic extremely, you know, it's,
Right,
you know, these
segregated.
separate worlds. Yeah, segregated is the word. And so it has difficulties to it. And you can get very complacent here. Comfort is numbing, and it's a very comfortable place to be. At the same time, it's a place to be where the human misery index is often fairly low. And while that is rare and is not the world most people live in, I also feel it's the world that human beings are capable of living in and granting each other. It's just that at the moment it seems to come with extreme wealth at its edges. So this place has its problems and it also has its beauty. But to live here means entering the economy in a way where I can't necessarily just do the things that feed the soul. And so that was a long way of saying, I do think about living more simply. I lived in a yurt for like a year and a half after the divorce, and I liked being simple. I liked having fewer things or having things in storage or at friends' houses. And we don't need all the crap
We
and
absolutely don't.
complication we have. This is a nonsensical society. And so, yeah, I would love to be outside of that. But the other thing is right now, my job, I also feel like is very, as far as things that do make sense to me, the thing about making music is I'm lucky to have people who want to hear it. And it's a very direct exchange, meaning that there's a value that people will place on seeing me sing songs or seeing the band play. And we have a general understanding of what that level is. And depending on how many people show up, that's my living. There isn't like mailbox money and residual stuff coming in. I haven't had a placement, you know, film or TV in whatever it is, 13 years. So I get paid depending on how much I work and on how much people value my music. And there's something very clean about that. It's not an hourly wage. I can't leave it when I go home, but I can work harder or less hard, and I can do things, and I can use the band tour to essentially pay for doing things
Right.
like community song leading. And stepping into that world has been interesting. It's a very, God, it's a beautiful, the collection of song leaders from around this country and even around the world are people who are probably ridiculously underpaid for the most part and are they're doing it for the spirit and the service and the joy of bringing music to people. So the community singing world it kind of came out of natural voice choirs in England. It was just simply the act of having a choir where instead of having to have like the perfect operatic trained voice, anyone was welcome. Or even if not anyone, at least You didn't have to sing like anybody other than yourself. So that came into the States where I guess the easiest way to describe it, are you
I'm not.
familiar with kirtan at all? So kirtan is there's old Sanskrit, 1,000 to 3,000 year old Sanskrit. It's things like Om Mane Padme Om. Simple, repetitive, mostly saying like Rama, yes, Rama, or, something similar. These really simple things. You'll hear them in like a yoga class, and they're often sung in a group. So you'll have a room and you just sing this song for maybe 15 minutes. They're very short, and they'll kind of rise and fall in intensity. Or probably if you grew up in church, there's the longer form songs, or there's the ones that are just
Right.
like, it's kind of a verse and a chorus. They're like really short, and you repeat them, but you get deeper and deeper into them. And so there are a lot of songs that are, maybe 2 lines long, but they'll have 2 counter melodies on top of them, because non-trained singers, it's easier to sing a counter melody if you're not musically fluent than it is to sing a harmony. Harmonies tend to confuse non-musicians. And so it's songs that are designed at their root to be quick to learn, easy to sing, and to be just challenging enough that your brain is woken up. And so in an evening of community singing, it'll be like an hour and a half, and we'll maybe do 10 songs. And so they're quick teaches for new people. And then you sing this simple repetitive thing for maybe 5 minutes, and you go deep. And, there's a certain amount of cultural
Sure.
appropriation, usually with, hopefully with a little proper research and credit where credit is due, but trying to even figure out like which cultures are more sensitive to appropriation. Hinduism tends to often have the idea that if you're singing something, if you're singing Loka Samasta Sukhino Bhavantu, right? May all beings be safe and happy, right? It's always good to sing that. So you just go ahead and sing that. And there are other cultures who are much more, I don't sing any indigenous American songs because I haven't had permission to sing any indigenous North American songs. There are some things from South or Central America that I may sing, or songs in Spanish that I wrote, or not that I can speak Spanish well at all, but I did. Or there's an Oshun song for the Orisha Oshun, and she's the goddess of sweet flowing waters, and she's the youngest, most generous, and singing to Oshun feels justifiable to me. And so occasional gospel song. For a bit, I sang spirituals, and then I stopped. I felt that I didn't have the right to. So it's a kind of constant asking of like, whose tradition is this? And if you ask anyone in that tradition, you're going to get different answers as to whether it's okay or what degree of attribution you have to give. So there's a constant kind of trying to mark what's okay, what's not okay, and then also what do people need, and they need these songs to sing. And so there are a lot of these songwriters, so we'll be singing, poems of Thich Nhat Hanh, or and so it's this wide ranging selection of material, but it ends up having this, it's a little bit perhaps Unitarian, but not even that deist.
I get it. Yeah.
If that makes sense. And there's a lot of people who show up who went to church as a kid, and they remember the effect of singing uplifting songs together, and they miss it. And they want that, but they don't want dogma surrounding it. But they want experiences that are bringing them into presence and bringing them into the now. And they don't want to have to swallow a whole lot of other stuff to do that. And it's amazing. And for me, once again, these things that you find and it feels like, oh, I've been searching for this thing for 20 years. I've been talking about non-performative music, wanting to do things where instead of being in front of an audience, that it's something we do together and create together, and that it's accessible to anyone. And I found that already there were all these, Barbara McAfee and Lawrence Cole, thank God for Lawrence Cole, and all these incredible, and Lisa Littlebird, who introduced me to this work, these song leaders who were creating that experience already, and that there was this rich library of music available to be doing this with. And so, yeah, I absolutely love this work. And I have generally been quiet about it because I wanted to, I don't know, develop skill with it, or even not pollute it by turning it into something where I was doing any kind of promotion. And I think I was lucky enough that I had other things to do, that I could just kind of hold it
Let it be
close
your
to the
thing.
chest and have it be word
Yeah.
of mouth for a long time. But I also have noticed that when new people are introduced to it, there's a handful of people, it's like, this is crazy hippie shit, I'll see you later. Handful of people who are like, I've been looking for this my entire life. And then an even smaller handful, and for me, the really important handful, is the people who hear this and are musically adept and go, I've been looking for this and I need to start leading. I need to start doing this. And I feel like even with doing it kind of halfway secretly in Santa Barbara, there's like at least 3 other people who are
That's
now doing
awesome.
song leading, and so I'm ready to take it kind of on the road, because I want to introduce more people to it, because I don't think you can have too much of people singing together, and of the many things that this culture lacks. And part of it is technology, but part of it is also, honestly, the idea of, I don't know, American individualism or something, in our own crazy history, right?
Yeah.
Where we don't sing together unless it's in church. We don't have, if you go to a bar in the States, if you go to a bar anywhere else in the world, someone can start singing a song that's not Sweet Caroline, and everybody else in the
We'll join
bar
in.
will start singing along. Yeah, the flamenco tradition, like everyone in Spain knows those songs, right? And you go, or fado, or you go to Brazil and you go to Bahia, and like all these bands wandering around town, they're all playing like the same 10 songs, and everyone knows every one of those songs. You still stop, you still dance, you still sing. Like, it's culturally owned. And you go to New Orleans and you get that there, right? There are pockets in the United States where there is a shared musical heritage that's not recorded, that's not performative, that's actually inclusive. For me, I feel like that is the central nutrients of belonging, in the same way there's like the pyramid of nutrition
Right.
pyramid, not that it's entirely accurate, but in our hierarchy of communal needs, that there is, somebody talked about the 4 pillars of storytelling: silence, movement, and song, like that. And I would add food to that, right? The things we do together as cultures, that every culture that has ever existed has always done, we don't do anymore. We get our storytelling on the television. We do our dancing in nightclubs trying to get laid. We sing along with pre-recorded music, or we go to concerts, which is close, but it's not the same as owning a song together and creating the song together. There's this focal point of the performer and the spectacle of that. And I mean, the best moments I have ever had musically have been in song circles or in yurts, and,
Be a hippie.
so I'm a hippie. And once again, some people aren't turned on by this, but I'm more turned on by this than I am by just about anything else. And I think as we get more frayed as a culture and more contentious, and that, it's not just left and right eating each other alive. The left is eating the left and the right is eating the right. Like, we're in a weird place, and it is harder to hate or judge people when you sing with them. And and for me, there's an element of coming back to common ground. And if you see somebody across from you you've disagreed with or think is, weird in whatever way, and you just see them being overcome in song, with feeling, with thought, with their own humanity, and vulnerability, it's like, okay, you're going to be more willing to reach out through your difference to that person. And I noted for myself during 2020, I got to a point of oversaturating my own judgment and rage, to a point where I didn't feel like I could function anymore. And I had become what I hated. And I was so angry all the time that I wasn't of much use to anybody. And then I realized I wasn't going to change how anybody thought. So I had to open my heart a lot wider than I thought it could open in order to, the turning point for me, honestly, was my girlfriend and I walked into a grocery store, and this woman in her 60s walked out. And she gave us, like, her eyes were so beautiful. She had her mask on, but her eyes were like clearly like loving and smiling at us. And she had on a Make America Great red mask. And I just wanted to yell at her. And and it was this thing of like, okay, I'm the hateful, judgmental one now. And I know I disagree with her really strongly about some incredibly important things. And she's the one smiling at me with these beatific eyes and opening her heart. And I'm stepping out of a Prius. She knows I'm a libtard, like, right? And so, you know, and and just this feeling of like, God damn it, I got to be bigger. If she can be bigger, I can be bigger. And so, and I'm still trying to figure out what that means, and what are the
Yeah.
points where your rage is justified, and what are the points where you have to speak truth
Yeah,
to
I mean,
power, and you do.
that's sort
But I
of
mean, there's
where
this.
the thing that I struggle with often in with regards to people who don't align with me politically is that sometimes, many times, it's my existence that's being called into question, and I feel like I've reached a point
Yeah,
where I can't have a discussion, an unemotional discussion with someone who has questions about my existence, whether it's, color of my skin or sexual orientation or whatever it is. It's just very hard for me to sort of reach
yeah,
across that, reach across the table, as it were, and see them with anything but eyes that are like bursting in flames. You know what I'm saying?
yeah. And it's at the end of that, like, and what I have trouble understanding, like Dan Savage describes it as like the conservative, like a lack of moral imagination, right? If the first time you were able to think of gay people with compassion is because you had to choose between access to your child or being a bigot, right? And you go like, I guess I don't want to lose my kids, so I'm going to open my heart a little. And the part that's
I've
hard
done
to
that.
understand is, why wouldn't you have already done that? Or did you need to do that? It's the lack of imagination, lack of empathy. You know, once again, like, we moved into our house, or the place we're renting right now, and right across the street from us was this Blue Lives Matter sign. And like, I just immediately went into a rageful tirade. It's like, because for me, Blue Lives Matter is sticking your fingers in your ear and saying, I refuse to hear your pain. I refuse to hear your story, by denying that
Right.
Black Lives Matter. Blue lives are actually protected by law. There are specific laws that if you
Hmm.
shoot a cop, you get a harsher sentence. And so it's
Blue lives
literally
matter. Yes.
enshrined in law that blue lives matter. There's no debate here. There's no question here. And there's no equivalency. And all lives matter. There's no equivalency. And it's such to me, a galling lack of ability to listen and put aside your own personal struggles for half a second to
Hmm.
even try to understand someone else's. But I also know that when my girlfriend tells me there are certain subjects we get into, our deepest emotional, like, conflicts, right? These things that are our work together. We know we're in the right, how can I say this? We know we're in the right relationship because our work appears to be the deepest soul work about our deepest insecurities, as opposed to just being shitty to each other or wondering if somebody's hotter somewhere, right? Like, I come down to these basic feelings. Do I belong here? Am I a good person? Can I give? And when we're talking about this stuff, I will jump to defensiveness sometimes. And when she calls me on my defensiveness, it's the worst. Like, I totally double down on it. And it hurts her, and there we are in our thing that we go into. And if I can't hear from the person I sleep with and I've chosen as my partner, if I can't hear some criticism from her, it also helps me understand how hard it can be if that people are, which doesn't
Sure.
make it right. It doesn't make it okay, even for half a second. But I'm not going to brutalize people into opening up. And the times where I've actually been able to get people to step back from the knee-jerk reaction is when I've been slow enough and kind enough and hand-holding enough to be able to hear them and hear that they're worried about their place in the world and that they're insecure about where they are. And like, to get right, there's the quote about how the loss of privilege feels like
Yeah.
injustice.
Yeah.
Right? Because you're used to it. We acclimate. And if people are scared, everybody's scared of losing their place right now, right? Things aren't stable. And to kind of go, okay, so your privilege, you've taken it for, the difference between, for me, privilege and entitlement is that privilege is something that is, and entitlement is something unexamined that you think you deserve. Or even
Sure.
examined, worse yet, that you think you deserve. That you actually see how unfair it is, but you actually think you're deserving of it. But privilege happens. You're born into situations. You live in situations. You have access that other people don't, depending on any number of things. And privilege exists. Entitlement is, I think, a choice. And you can step down, you can give up privileges, but it's very hard for people to give up privilege, right? And this question of, well, if I give up my privilege, is anyone else really using it? Or am I just sacrificing for the sake of sacrificing?
Yeah.
And that's a long and nuanced debate, right? And there are points where I think people who look like me are going to have to give up a lot. And it's going to be hard. But do you give up your education? Education is a privilege. Do you give up your education? You can't give up your education. It's embedded in your soul. It's embedded in your language and your knowledge base. And so there are also privileges that are more or less fungible than others, right? And so back to the Blue Lives Matter thing, it's like, oh God, I really want to put up a rainbow flag. And I want to get, and our neighbors down below had up, they put facing these people yards, the yard sign of all are welcome and, love is love. And do I want to go to battle, or am I just going to see when that dude's outside and go introduce myself and talk to him? And I ended up doing that. And, military background from Virginia, like, we're really different. And says, if you want to go fishing on my boat sometime, it's like, and just this, like, we're clearly from so much else. We're doing yoga in our yard and he's seeing us do yoga. We know where we stand on these things. And it's this question of like, am I going to show him something by being a good neighbor? Or am I going to show him more by getting in an argument that he doesn't want to hear?
And a good neighbor, someone could take being a good neighbor as kind of being a patsy, and someone could take being confrontational the incorrect way as well. So you kind of don't know whether the soft approach or the hard approach is going to work.
How can I say this? There's nobody close to me who was full on MAGA. There's one guy in a wider local circle of who kind of went QAnon. And the anti-vax world has been more interesting for me because within my hippie world or alternative health, yoga world, all these places, there's a lot of anti-vax sentiment. And my best friend is libertarian, which is its own interesting combination of things. But I'm one of the only libtards, to use the awful term, is the joke. It's offensive in so many ways. But I'm one of the only people, like, I have friends for whom these conversations, especially in terms of anti-vax, societal trust, just the concept of you have your own personal liberty, but these are conversations about public health. And they fall into a different realm of mutual care for each other, talking about disinformation. I've had to develop the ability to have respectful conversations through those things more. And I developed a lot of those skills back in the day with Toad, just in talking with evangelicals who assumed I was part of that club, and learning how to disagree really strongly while also finding some common humanity. That's a skill that I'm better at, is being a good neighbor first and then having hard conversations later. And they've had enough experience of liberals. I won't use that offensive term anymore. You can beep it
It's
out
fine.
for the rest of it. Right? If you want to beep it, I'm good with you beeping it. It's offensive, but it's their term, not mine. Doesn't mean I can use it. Anyway, there's this, for me, what I felt is bad, like the skill that I keep trying to develop. And it's the skill that, the more I listen to, like, Tara
Mm-mm.
Brach or other, do you know her at all? Brach. She's an amazing Buddhist teacher. Really got me through COVID. Still getting me through COVID. But the sin of bad othering. She talks about bad othering, assuming that other people are terrible people, even if they believe things you think are terrible. How do you
Right.
stand up for justice without demonizing people? And in my own skill set, I find that when I get angry, I get stupid. And when I argue, I get stupid. And I don't help my cause. I forget salient details. And then when I take that route of, I'm going to get to know this person, I'm going to ask this person what they're concerned about, what they're scared of, what they care about, what they're worried about, where, if it's something like, vaccines, like how they lost their trust. Because
Sure.
most of these people lost their trust at great expense, right? I have a friend, his wife basically, like within a couple months, just dropped dead. Doctors couldn't help. I get why he doesn't trust doctors. His life was ruined. And
Sure.
you can argue, hey, medicine is imperfect and everyone dies. But I understand why he doesn't have trust. I understand why other people I care for
Sure.
deeply don't have
That's a
trust.
risk. I can definitely see how that works.
Yeah, and those are all over, right? I mean,
Yeah.
we got Tuskegee, we got,
Yeah.
in Africa we have the AIDS crisis. There are countless reasons why people don't trust. And then the question for me is, okay, so your trust is free floating. Why did you put it in Joe Rogan? Like, come on. Like, he doesn't deserve your trust. Brett
Yeah. It's.
Weinstein does not deserve your trust.
I,
Like,
I,
Brett
I think
Weinstein is,
one thing that. Yeah.
no, please. Like,
Yeah.
and that's where I can at least be funny about it, but I and then we can have a laugh about it and talk about but it's like me going online, even in the last week, wanting to post stuff and thinking, I'm not going to make anything better. I already lost half my audience during my live casts that I was doing during COVID, because I was enraged and I spoke out about it, and I lost a lot of people who I know I will never reach. And I lost a lot of other people whom, if I'd kept a slightly higher tone, that I wouldn't have lost. And so, like, for me, it's that matter of, even if I'm not going to change anybody's views, it's very hard to do that. For them to remember that there's a couple of people like me in the world who they think are actually pretty good guys, and that the story they're being told about how evil we are and this whole completely falsified agenda,
Yeah.
like, I think that guy actually wants the best for everybody. And you're up against people who often don't want the best for everybody, right? Who are just
There's.
flat out
Yeah.
racist,
Pieces of shit.
homophobic, misogynist turds. and and then there are a lot of people who are just simply raised in that culture and haven't examined it. And if they're not insulted and turned away and offended, have a chance of opening up a little and not changing their whole orientation. And I do think, actually, we need conservatives, we need liberals, we need balances of opinion, we need a spectrum of intelligent viewpoints. And if the left devolves into total
Right.
correctness policing, we're fascists. And if the right devolves into the depths of ultra fundamentalist, racist misogyny, they're fascists. And so we're having to keep a more loving tone to anything, even when you're talking about injustice, even when you're talking about the worst of the worst. Like, it's more of an art than it's ever been before. But once we dehumanize those who think differently than us, then I don't think we have a chance.
We do.
And I do think we need fighters, but
Yeah.
we also need
Yeah.
bridge builders. It takes both. And I've noticed I'm shitty in a fight. I'm good at bridge building. And
Sure.
so it's also like kind of knowing where you're useful and making an effort to, without like losing my moral standing and what I feel to be true, to also, I don't want to be the patsy. I don't want to be an apologist. But I feel like where I can be not quite an apologist, but say, these are all human people. These are all people with big feelings. And the one thing you can't argue with is how somebody feels. You can argue with all the narratives around it, but you can't argue with how they feel. And so, and when you tell people that their feelings are not allowed,
That makes sense.
they'll stop listening to you immediately. And or that their feelings aren't real, or their experience isn't real. Because frankly, all we have is our experience, right? And that's a way of canceling out their humanity. And so there's a little listening, which can be incredibly frustrating, especially if people are seeing crazy, hateful things. And I tried for a while. At some point in my live streams, I said, if there's any like conservatives still listening to this, can we like have a phone call and you tell me what you care about and what you're concerned about? And what I did find is that with almost all of them, they were really concerned about security for their family, for their livelihood. They were scared of like the safety of their life, and that it might be taken away or that people might be hurt. And they had this strong sense of like, justice. And I also felt like we bumped up quickly against axiomatic beliefs about what the facts were in the world
Sure.
that were so divergent that it was really hard to continue talking. But to simply even be able to go like, okay, you know what? I'm seeing some of this doesn't feel logical. Some of this feels logical. I see that you have a lot of heart. I see you care about the people around you and your family and your community. And there are these weird, statistics like of conservatives giving more to charities, right? Partially that's because a lot of them are embedded in churches and there's more church going. And I've had that experience overall. You go to the southern states and there's all this embedded racism and misogyny. And at the same time, people
It's so
will give you
complicated.
the shirt
Yeah.
off their back.
Yeah.
They will yank your car out of it. It's so complicated. And so to simply have that conversation and be able to go, wow, we are dealing at some point with a set of facts that's really different that I don't know if we're going to agree on. But at least what I can see, and hopefully you see with me, is that if we take out this difference in facts, we're actually both really concerned for our community and the people we love, and that we want a fair playing field. I happen to think affirmative action makes for a
Right.
fairer playing
Right.
field. You
Right.
think it's racism, but we're both saying
Right.
we both want the fair playing field. And there are points where you can push this and find these disingenuous edges. And I have this, with the anti-abortion world, is like, if you want to save the baby, there was this pilot program in Colorado where they were offering, and once again, this is controversial in some circles too, they were offering long-term like Norplant birth control to low-income women. And there are other people that will say, and there are people who say rightly, is this eugenics within
Right.
the poor community? Or you just stop, there's a whole debate there. So I'm going to lay that debate aside for 1 second. Or I'm just going to lay this debate aside to say they did this program for a year in Colorado. And I believe it took abortion rates down like 42%. and took unwanted pregnancies down by something like 46%. Just free available long-term birth control. And if you were an anti-abortion activist, you would think that that would be, it's like the single most effective, anti-abortion thing ever done, right? And it was cost benefit because the lack of social services money, the money that would have gone into the
Of
adoptions and the
course.
kids on welfare. And it was like, hey, that there's this, it actually paid for itself. And this is a privately funded study. And the Republicans in the state of Colorado wouldn't make it permanent because they thought it sent the wrong message about premarital sex and sex out and they would rather that people didn't enjoy premarital sex than that there were these abortions. So for me, that like, it's in these things where we have common ground, right? Where it's like, okay, if you want to stop abortion, you stop poverty and you increase education and accessibility to medical care. Those are the ways in which you take that down. And you want to stop drug use, you stop poverty, you stop
Yep.
hopelessness, you let people have
Yep.
lives with purpose and create things aside from McJobs. You create a society where giving back to society might actually give you enough to eat and live a life of dignity. These are the ways you fight these things. But when it comes down to that, like, there's such a punitive nature of like, nope, can't have people enjoying
Right.
sex, can't have
Right.
people not getting punished
Right.
for
It's
being
like the
poor. And
destination's the
that's
same,
where I
but
kind of
then
go,
to those destinations are very, very, very different.
yeah, but
Sure.
at least I'm trying to understand how those maps are, and then you can have a conversation. And I still get curious of, okay, so when these maps are different, like, what's that line where we stop having common ground? What's the point at which we stop being able to have a conversation? And
It's a trip. It's a
yeah, it
trip.
trips me out.
I'm
It
conscious of
trips me
time.
out.
I do want to ask two quick questions of you, though. One, as a relatively
Yeah,
newly
yeah.
minted 50-year-old, were there any revelations? Was there any fear? Was there any trepidation?
I mean, yeah, I constantly worry that, especially living here, that I will either have a home again, like a home that I don't have to worry about getting kicked out of someday or the rent getting too high. There's this feeling of like I have this choice between having anything left for retirement or having a more permanent home, and that those are mutually exclusive given the economics of my life and the place I'd like to live, that I was born in, that my communities. But I also have this feeling, because my dad died at 59, that I'm going to die in, at this point, 8 years. I'm almost 51. And this feeling of like my father's mortality is my mortality. And so there's this incredible stress, and it
It
was
doesn't
pointed
for
out to
most
this.
people.
None of this has to make sense, but but this weird like economic panic combined with a feeling that I've only got 10 years, so I should just have some fun. And behind that, also this feeling like, and in 10 years, man, we're going to be climate refugees, and in 4 years, we're going to be fascist.
Mhm.
And so these are always kind of going around in my head. I've always had a little bit of Chicken Little in my outlook. And it's been really weird to have these things feel like my worst fears are coming true, but I haven't reconciled that. I had a really weird experience a few months ago where I had some occlusion in one of my ears and went to get it checked out. And the doctor's like, well, there's a chance it's a tumor sitting in there. If it is, there are these various, and I went to
Hey,
the like, oh, I have a brain tumor. I'm going to die in a year or two. And the funny thing about it was I felt immediately okay. Like, it takes a lot of pressure off. I gotta get my estate in order. I gotta get rid of all the extra stuff. I don't want my kids to have to get rid of. I know I want to do some, I'll stop doing the things that don't make me happy for money. I'll do as much as I can, as long as I can, of the things that do make me happy. I won't worry about money. And it was almost unnerving that at this age I went so easily into like,
Yeah.
oh, just total relief. But because it was going to be really simple, and I'm like, I know the people. I love so many people, and I just like it. I mean, my life for what I can complain about, home or that I sabotaged my career, this and that. The fact of my life is that I am rich in the people I love and that love me, and that I of any of the things that I might change in my life, I wouldn't be anybody else because I love my friends more than life itself. Like, and I have a
That is
cornucopia.
amazing.
Like, I have too many people I love deeply to even give them what they're worth. Like, it's the greatest. And I should feel that because of my social capital, like, I'll be okay. I'm not going to starve in the streets, but I guess I would like to get myself. I've talked about this before at shows. Like, man, the people I know who lived through cancer have the best attitude because they face death, and now every day is bonus for them, right? And they
Hmm.
love living, and they are not sweating the small stuff. And it's like, so how do you
I'm
get a
trying to
cancer
that
attitude
is
without the
what I'm trying
cancer?
to figure out as well.
Well, and which is why I've put more. I mean, the one of the hardest things for me about COVID is that it made community singing a really it made community singing, this kind of
And yeah,
antisocial behavior,
yeah.
right? Standing in a circle and spitting at each other forcibly. It's still, I did like 3 sessions right before Delta hit, and then had to shut it down again, and then went on tour. And so, and once again, within that group of people, I'm dealing with, it's a lot of people in their 50s, 60s, 70s. So it's
Hmm.
a community of people who are more at risk. And there's some anti-vax people. There's some people who are hyper conservative and concerned and wouldn't, and trying to thread the needle of everybody's comfort and needs. I'm just taking a little more of a break from it right now. But, doing things that are giving back and helping people wake up and keeping my input, the books I read, the things I'm curious about, like,
Yeah,
keeping
I
those
googled her,
positive.
so I
Once
have a
again,
window up
Tara
with her name
Brach,
on
if
it.
you ever get to listen to her, she's really wonderful. And, in reading, in thinking
Giving
about,
me a
do
lot
you
of
know
names
David
here,
White, the
Glenn.
poet? Yeah, but he's trying to think how to describe him. He has a book called Consolations. He writes a lot of poetry, but he has a book called Consolations that's all on commonly used words and kind of deeper understandings of them. And there's one on anger that is one of the best things I've ever read, which talks about, it
Huh.
says, anger is the deepest form of compassion,
Yeah.
which sounds weird at the beginning, right? But that when stripped of its initial flush of violence and ferocity, anger tells us what we care most about and are most passionately
That's
willing
right.
to defend, right? Anger is when something threatens the thing that you will never allow to be threatened. And so to take that part, not the fury at what the threat is, but to understand it's like your anger will tell you what you love. And just to look at it that way, right? And even to look at, grief and loss. Martine Prachtel is like a teacher who wrote a book called The Smell of Rain on Dust, all about grief, and talking about basically how Westerners are really not good at grief. And he talks about how in the Mayan language, grief and praise are the same word. And that the Mayan concept of grief and praise is that they're both love plus time and loss. And so that grief is praising what you love and have lost, but praise is grieving what you love and will lose. So, and just this idea through that, and like my way of expressing it would be, it's like with grief, you cry for what you love,
Mm-hmm.
and that everything you love changes or passes. And that, so grief, we have this attitude of it's something you stuff in and you don't express, and that like your tears are bad. But like, for me, it's like, oh, it's a symptom of love. It's a symptom of having things, and, David White will talk about, with grief, your children just growing old and moving away from you breaks your heart. Like, heartbreak is a sign that
That
you're
is true.
functioning. And so to be alive in this world right now and not be constantly heartbroken, for me, is like the saddest possible thing. It means that you've walled yourself off so you won't get hurt. And if you are in this world right now and you are constantly heartbroken, you're doing a
It's
great
hard to
job.
hear.
Like, you're
Right.
you're paying
Right.
attention,
Right.
and you haven't
Yeah,
stopped
I
caring.
agree with you. That is difficult to hear a little bit because it's sort of like then you always find yourself in this weird space between being thrilled and being in pain all the time.
Yeah. And so then your next job with that, and sometimes you need to rest, and sometimes you need to hide, and you need to make some popcorn and watch Netflix and regather your strength, or whatever your method is. And sometimes you need to build your capacity to feel. And that's the other part of it. The work, like when I, and won't go into it, but like plant medicine work for me, which I found right around the same time of my divorce, taught me about expanding my capacity to feel. And there are a lot of paths to that. Once again, I think it's easy to be, and it's so trendy now, and people go on and on about, there is, mindfulness meditation. There's so many ways in which to go about this process, but for me, that was the one that set where a light bulb went off, and was like, I need to be able not to shut down or just select the good feelings, but I need to grow my capacity. And if you read, whether it's, Gandhi or Thich Nhat
You're giving
Hanh,
me
and
a lot
like
of
the life of
research.
Thich Nhat Hanh. Have you read Thich Nhat Hanh at all? Buddhist teacher, grew up in Vietnam. Like, he's, oh God, he speaks in almost childlike language, but is so fucking profound. And he went through the Vietnam War, and he's been doing work where he had both like the communists and the Westerners, like both thinking he was working for the other, and he's just like, I'm just trying to help people. I'm going to help anyone. I'm feeding people. I'm taking care
Right.
of people. And if you have a problem with who I take care of, screw you. I'm taking care of people. And if that makes me your enemy, it's really your issue. And like, his level of compassion and bravery and strength is unbelievable. He has a poem called Call Me By My True Names. It's just like, God damn, his poems are good. And he suffered for them, and managed to walk out with immense capacity, and capacity that took a ton of work, a ton of deciding to shut many things out in order to, create a deeper capacity. Meaning, he was a monk, not married, and even talking about sexual infidelity, it's like, well, yeah, there's the morals of this, but the reason we also say to do this is,
Right.
uh,
Right.
you got to be focused on better things than
Right.
screwing around. Like, if you're worried
Right.
about getting laid all the time, you're not feeding people, and it's better to feed people. And he's just like, come on, have priorities. And so he's, with any of these better teachers, it's like, and I do tilt towards the Buddhist. I wouldn't say I am a Buddhist, but I would
Sure.
say my philosophical underpinnings are much more in that direction. But that idea of building your own capacity to feel and to contain, I think, is the only way not to shut down, and to understand that you will have more joy, and you will have more pain, and you will have more sadness, and that you'll be able to more cleanly move through those things. I mean, one of the things that I aspire to do in the next few years. That once again, the path I was on that kind of got shut down by COVID. One of the most profound experiences I've ever had was a grief ceremony where there's some talking and there's some kind of, preparation, but the core of this thing is it's this like 45-second song that, you get about 30 people in a room and you sing this song and you're drumming and singing for 3 to 5 hours, one song, nonstop. And you go kind of deep. And a few people who've done it before go to the altar first, like raise a hand when you go to, and this came out of, Francis Weller had similar teachers, but Sabamfu and Samale were the two main teachers who were apparently told by their elders that white people were crazy because they didn't know how to grieve. So go to America and teach white people how to grieve. And so it's this process where you're singing or you're wailing. And when you go to the altar, somebody's standing there witnessing you behind you. And if you need them to touch your back, if you need them to be there closer, they can be there or to hold, but they're there to witness. And you weep and wail for as long as you need. And when you're done, you walk back in and people in the village, in the circle, and the singers say thank you. And then you start singing and you're part of it again. And so there's no opportunity for an individual to take up too much space or over narrate. And you don't even know why it's moving through you, but you're held. You're able to be that person, for me, the person who was told he had to act like a human being, and just let every single bit of tears come out of you, and then go support others while they do. Immediately after, you're back in a support role, and it's a seamless transition. And like I said, I'm a hippie. That's my idea of a party. Like, that's my idea of like the best possible night is singing and wailing and drumming for 4 hours. And you go through it and you're closer to all these people, and you didn't have to tell everybody every thought. You just got to be there for them and know that whatever they're feeling is what they're feeling. That's all you need to know. Because, and in a group like that, you get people who lost their child. You get people who lost their parents. You get people. There is in this setup. I think the Francis Weller book on this work is called The Wild Country of Grief, something to that effect. But it's there's a primary altar that is the grief altar. There's an anger altar for people who've been abused. There's an ancestral altar, and there's a forgiveness altar. And anyone can kind of move freely between these. And you can go ancestry and forgiveness are ones you go to by yourself. You're not witnessed on those. But I want to lead that work. I mean, to me, that's like people allowing themselves to go in that place. I just think it expands your capacity to hold what you feel, expands your capacity to understand that everyone's carrying a heavy load, right? There's one of Lawrence Cole's songs in this is, be kind, everyone carries a heavy load. And just to get that is like the baseline. And then through that perspective, at least for me, that's like the revolution that I want to help be a part of, is the revolution of the heart, where it's like not, you can still go in the streets. You can still, but that you're driven by compassion instead of anger.
I've been thinking a lot about this conversation, and not just because I've been editing it to post. Glenn raises a lot of valid points about having to interact with people who have different social and political views than us. Personally, a lot of people on the right side of the political spectrum have views that take issue with my humanity, so it's incredibly difficult to find common ground. And I don't really recommend attempting to find common ground with people who would deny your right to exist or exist equally. That takes a level of kindness and grace that I think I might be incapable of. However, I think those of us that are capable of reaching across the divide and finding common ground should try to do so. It's important to have allies, and allyship, I think, is pivotal when it comes to getting people to change their thoughts about certain things. Exposure can certainly change minds, and I think it might be easier, or at least less mentally taxing, for people like Glen, who happens to be white and straight identifying, to work across these differences than it would for me. At any rate, this was a great conversation. I want to thank Glen for offering his time and wisdom. I also want to wish Glen a happy birthday. He celebrated his birthday recently. I have been a fan of Toad the Wet Sprocket since I was a teenager, as you know if you've listened to the beginning of this episode, and it was a thrill to talk to him again. You can find them at glenphillips.com and at Glen Phillips, his name, on Twitter and Instagram. Also, make sure you check out Starting Now, the album Toad the Wet Sprocket, released in the fall of 2021. It's a good one. Thanks again, Glen. Thanks for listening to the Detoxicity podcast. My name is Mike Joseph. Once again, if you want to find me online, hit me up on Instagram at DetoxPod Guy. I'm on Twitter intermittently at TizMikeJoseph. You can go to Facebook.com/Detoxicity. You can email me, detoxpod@gmail.com. Love to hear constructive criticism, love to hear feedback. Would love if you are a potential guest or you know somebody who you think would be a potential guest, please by all means reach out to me. And remember, if you enjoy this podcast, subscribe, rate, comment, do all of the things necessary to push this podcast up in the podcast rankings and get this into as many ears as possible. Tell a friend, do whatever it is you need to do. And thank you once again for listening. I personally want to thank the following people for their support: Calvin Williams and Jacob Block, Jeff Giles, and Andrew Grossman. Thank you very much. I hope all of you stay well, stay safe, and healthy. Until next time.